Welcome back to the deep dive. So, you've brought a fascinating set of sources this time. It all seems to revolve around the end of World War I and, well, what happened next.
Yeah.
It's not just dates and battles this time. We're going deeper. We want to really grasp why this period is so crucial, how it essentially set the stage for, well, a lot of the 20th century's turmoil, kind of like looking at the very DNA of a very complicated century.
Right. It's like if we can understand what happened then and why, we might actually have a chance at understanding, well, the world we live in now a bit better, you know?
Absolutely. Your
Okay,
sources
well,
go all over the place, which is great. Collapsing empires, how the world map gets totally redrawn, arguments among the peacemakers, and oh, the long shadow of those treaties they signed. Like, our mission here is to connect those dots, see the bigger picture, not just what happened, but why it did and what it meant for the future.
it's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, you know? The desire to create a lasting peace, a good thing, right? But it's almost like that very desire after a war so devastating, well, it kind of backfired. It might have actually created the conditions for more instability down the line.
That's a huge point. That peace could lead to more conflict. Okay, let's break this down. The war ends. What happens to all those overseas colonies? You'd think the victors just gobble them up, right?
You'd think so, but what's interesting is they didn't. Instead, we get this new idea, mandates. These territories, they're not outright annexed. They're supposed to be overseen by the League of Nations, the brand new international organization. But in practice, it's mostly Britain and France running the show, just like old times.
So colonialism, but with a new name tag.
Pretty much. And you can see how that would lead to problems later on. I mean, people want self-determination, not just a change in who's calling the shots.
Right, right. Okay, we can't forget the Ottoman Empire and all this. They sided with Germany, and that wasn't just a random choice, was it?
Not at all. They had this long-standing tension with Britain and Russia. Like, they wanted to push back against those powers, and siding with Germany seemed like the way to do it. And the group running the Ottoman government at the time, the Young Turks, they're all about reform and change, so this fit into their plans, I guess.
So the Ottomans, this once massive empire, they get taken apart after the war. Big chunks of their territory gets divided up by the victors.
Right. But it's not just the end of the story. Out of that collapse, you get the birth of modern Turkey. And the guy who leads that charge, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, he's not just a military leader. He pushes for huge societal changes like modernization and secularism. Really fascinating figure.
So the world map is getting a serious makeover at this point. Early 1919, the Paris Peace Conference gets going. You imagine these guys sitting down, hashing it all out. But your sources paint a very different picture. This was anything but simple.
Yeah, it was a tangled mess, really. Like, why was finding lasting peace in Paris so much harder than, say, the Congress of Vienna back in 1815 after Napoleon?
Well, for one, the whole political game had changed. Back then, public opinion wasn't such a big deal. Nationalism wasn't this, all-consuming force. So those old-school diplomats, they could wheel and deal behind closed doors, make compromises that might not have made everyone happy, but got the job done.
So you're saying by the time of Paris, things like public opinion and nationalism, they'd become these huge forces that made compromise way harder.
Exactly. In Paris, you have leaders who answer to voters back home. You have more open discussions, less secrecy, so everyone's watching. And every nation, they're super focused on their own interests. Plus, you have all that wartime propaganda still swirling around, making people even more suspicious and less likely to give an inch.
And then, of course, you have Woodrow Wilson front and center as one of the big four. Oh, yeah, Wilson's a whole other factor. He's this idealist, right? He's got this vision for a new world order based on his 14 points, and he really believes in it. But the thing is, his ideas sometimes clash with what the European powers want. I mean, they've just gone through hell. They have very specific security concerns, and they're not always willing to compromise on those.
Sounds like a recipe for some serious clashes.
Yeah.
And on top of all that, there's this other big worry looming over everyone.
Oh, yeah, the Bolshevik Revolution. They're genuinely scared that this communist revolution could spread throughout Europe. That fear, it hangs over everything and definitely pushes them towards finding some kind of stable order, anything to prevent total chaos.
And for France, their top priority is pretty understandable, right? I mean, they want guarantees that Germany won't be able to threaten them again. They just went through absolute devastation.
Totally. That desire for security, it shapes everything for them, it drives their demands, and it has a huge impact on how the Treaty of Versailles turns out. And that treaty, people called it a peace without victory, which, when you look at what Germany got hit with, well, it's Pretty ironic.
Yeah, that phrase doesn't really hold up. The
Yeah.
terms were harsh. There's no way around it. And, the fact that both the armistice and the treaty itself were broken multiple times, that just shows how unstable things really were.
For sure. But Wilson, even though he had to make some major compromises, he still puts a lot of faith in the League of Nations. He sees it as this international body that can stop future wars through diplomacy and collective security.
A noble goal, no doubt. But let's get specific. What did the Treaty of Versailles actually mean for Germany? What were the consequences they had to face?
Oh, there were a lot. France, as we said, gets Alsace-Lorraine back, and they get hefty reparations payments. The Rhineland, which is key for German industry, it gets demilitarized, and Allied troops are stationed there. Then you have the restrictions on the German military. Army capped at 100,000, no submarines allowed, no air force, no tanks, no heavy artillery. Basically, they're stripped of any real power.
So no more military might for Germany. And then there's how the map of Eastern Europe gets completely redrawn. New countries pop up all over the place.
Yeah, it's a huge shift. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, the Baltic states, they all emerged from the wreckage of the old empires. And while the idea was to create nations that reflected national identities, it didn't always work out neatly. Like, you
Yes.
have Polish territory with large German populations. Those kinds of messy overlaps, they create tension right from the start.
And when it comes to the Treaty of Versailles, there are certain parts that are always super controversial.
The War Guilt Clause, Article 231, blaming Germany for the whole war. That really stings. And when you combine that with the massive reparations they have to pay, well, it's not surprising that it triggers outrage and resentment in Germany. They see it as unfair, both economically and morally.
You can only imagine the bitterness that would breed. And the Weimar Republic, the German government that had to sign this treaty.
They never really recover from that public anger, from the political instability that follows. It's a wound that festers, and it has big consequences for Germany and for Europe as a whole.
Which brings us to the broader impact. Your sources make a bold claim. The rise of totalitarian regimes. That's the single most important outcome of World War I and its aftermath.
And it makes sense when you think about it. The peace settlement, it creates all these problems. Economic hardship in Germany, this feeling of injustice, political instability all over Europe, national aspirations getting ignored. It's the perfect breeding ground for extreme ideologies to take root. People are desperate, they're looking for answers, and these radical movements promise solutions, even if those solutions are ultimately destructive.
And the League of Nations. Wilson's big hope for preventing another war.
The idea is great, right? International cooperation, collective security. But it doesn't have the teeth to really enforce its decisions, especially against powerful nations who decide to go rogue.
And while we talk about mandates as this new form of colonialism, the reality on the ground for a lot of people in those territories probably didn't feel so new.
It's a change in label, not necessarily in substance. Britain and France are still calling a lot of the shots. The power dynamics haven't really shifted that much.
And this was a truly global war, wasn't it? Not just confined to Europe.
Definitely. Troops from all over the world, especially from the colonies, fought in this war. And colonial nationalists, they saw this as a chance for change. They hoped that their contributions would lead to independence, to self-determination, but those hopes were largely dashed in Paris. And you can see how that sets the stage for future anti-colonial movements.
Sobering thought, all those aspirations denied. And it's not like everyone just accepted the way things went down at Versailles. There were dissenting voices.
Absolutely. T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, he had a different vision for the Middle East, one that didn't quite align with what the powers decided. And then there's John Maynard Keynes, the British economist. He was a really sharp critic of the Treaty of Versailles.
His book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, it's still debated today, right?
For sure. He argued that the treaty was way too harsh on Germany. He predicted that it would wreck their economy, which would then destabilize all of Europe. And, a lot of historians now say he was right. Of course, some people push back on that, saying that Keynes kind of ignored Germany's own role in starting the war and how harshly they treated other countries when they had the upper hand.
It's a complex historical debate, for sure. And looking at it all, it seems like a major flaw of the peace settlement was that it didn't really deal with the ethnic and national realities on the ground.
Yeah. They drew borders on maps, but they didn't always pay attention to the people living in those places. Like, you have Germans, Ukrainians, and Jews in Poland all unhappy with their new situation. That kind of resentment, it just creates more problems down the line.
So the Treaty of Versailles, it wasn't just the end of a war. It was, in a way, the beginning of something even worse.
Yeah. It laid the groundwork for World War II. That's the tragic legacy of all this.
A pretty sobering thought. So as we wrap this up, it's clear that the end of World War I wasn't the clean break everyone wanted. The decisions in Paris, yeah, they aimed for peace, but they were also driven by national self-interest. And in the end, they created new problems, left old wounds festering. The harshness of the treaties, the way borders were redrawn without thinking about the people living there, and the fact that colonialism, in essence, continued. All of it contributed to the disasters that followed just a generation later.
So here's something to think about. Given how much effort went into making peace, why do you think they failed so badly at creating real, lasting stability? Could they have done things differently? Or was the world just too broken, too full of anger and resentment for any peace to truly hold? It's a question worth pondering as you dig deeper into this period.
Lots to think about. As always, thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
My pleasure.